Hello folks, and thank you for stopping by. So have you seen the new Wolfman teaser? As this one looks very promising and leaves me with the impression that they might be going slightly avant-garde in the werewolf domain. Also, the trailer has adopted this fabulous new trend that we experience with the Longlegs marketing campaign, which does not reveal every plot detail or spoil exciting events. This formula leaves us pleasantly in the dark, harbouring a great sense of mystery and anticipation, as should be the case. What a fantastic idea that the studios clearly thought of all by themselves, and had absolutely nothing to do with the fact that mature audiences have been screaming for this for many years now. Anywho, moving on. I know I cannot be the only one, but does anyone else desperately crave a good old-fashioned werewolf movie instead of the endless stream of vampire stories that constantly bombard our screens? And don't get me wrong, I'm crazy excited for Nosferatu, and The Last Voyage of the Demeter wasn't too bad either. It was quite a fun ride in fact. But I've been wishing somebody would bring back the raw terror I once felt when I watched American Werewolf in London and The Howling. Those classic films were drenched in an atmosphere of primal fear, where the horror lies not just in the grotesque transformations, but in the underlying tension of losing control to the curse itself. These films played on the dread of isolation very well. They invoked the terror of the unknown, of being hunted by a creature that is both familiar and alien, monstrous yet tragically human. So, if you hadn't guessed already, I'm partial to a good werewolf film. The first piece of good news with Wolfman, set to release in January of 2025, is that the director is Leigh Whannell. This talented man wrote and directed 2020's The Invisible Man, an expertly crafted modern adaptation of H.G. Wells' original. At least I thought it was anyway. Also, the choice of the cast feels natural and doesn't seem stereotypically forced in any way, and the raw talent combined from the two leads is reason enough to interest me. The film stars Christopher Abbott and Julia Garner, with whom I'm sure most people are familiar by now. If not, Christopher has proven himself to be an extraordinarily versatile actor with many incredible films under his belt. I highly recommend Sweet Virginia. Now with Julia, you must watch Ozarks if you haven't done so already. Her performance in that series is phenomenal. She was like a force of nature in an already perfect and captivating show. Now, I hear some of you say, well, wait a minute, 2010's adaptation of The Wolfman involved more than a few prominent actors, including Benicio del Toro, Anthony Hopkins, and Emily Blunt. Yes, well, sadly that film turned out to be somewhat of an anticlimax, and despite all of its over-polished veneer and high production value, it lacked story cohesion and scares, quite frankly. The film's great moments helped elevate it to promising heights, but ultimately, it fell slightly flat for me. However, I strongly feel that this new instalment will not repeat past mistakes, but please don't quote me on that. The first thing that made my ears prick up and my hackles rise with excitement in this very short and sweet teaser was the screen tear effect as the title slowly became revealed, instantly taking me back to my childhood. The subtle nod towards Alien as each letter emerges one by one, and the small amounts of background light bleeding through each slash, reminds me heavily of the 80s with its creative styles and experimentation. It was a time when films like this were unapologetically imaginative in their methods to try and scare and disturb us. As the trailer presents a few glimpses of unsettling scenes, it's safe to say that we can understand the basic premise of this film, which shows us a couple and their young daughter relocating away from the city and to the countryside in Oregon, for the quiet life, of course. Clearly, their initial adjustment period never concludes the way they intended, as they begin to hear the inevitable noises at night, and encounter a resident who not only terrorizes the family, but will also pass on the dreaded curse to the father. Thankfully, we are not force-fed anything more than a few fleeting images and lines of dialogue to whet our appetites, and whet it has. I could always be wrong, but I get a strong sense that this new adaptation will take things in a much-needed back-to-basics direction, but with a slight twist to spice things up. This is similar to what 2021's The Cursed was able to achieve. After 2010's The Wolfman, I think I'd rather avoid a big sprawling epic with all the baggage and problems those large-scale pictures tend to be burdened with. Call me old-fashioned, but I desire a hearty and simplistic werewolf film that invests you into the characters and firmly places us in dire situations, which I'm sure Wolfman will provide based on what the teaser shows us so far. From a personal perspective as well regarding cinematography, I love seeing so much of the countryside in a horror thriller movie like Wolfman. This isn't solely because the isolated and untamed setting pairs so well with the story's vibe, but because I live so close to London and we don't have anything like this. I mean, look at the vista, I'm drawn to it, as hopefully I will be in regards to the story and performances as well. It's hard to ascertain how maturely Wolfman will handle the gore, a fundamental aspect of any self-respecting werewolf film, right? Too much or too little can offset the balance, but the quick shots the trailer shows us demonstrates good taste. From the bloodied fingernails to the shredded flesh and dislodged teeth, the best compliment I can give it is that it looks believably painful rather than obscene or tacky. We even get a few glances at the creature on several occasions. Although brief, we get a sense of what we are dealing with, and it almost appears more man than beast. This may not be the fully transformed end result unless we've become privy to cinema's first bald werewolf. It does look suitably visceral and creepy, even if it lacks hair. So let's talk briefly about how the werewolf is presented, shall we? One issue that might prevent me from finding the film as scary as I would like is a particular component that also detracted from the last version of Wolfman starring Benicio del Toro. This issue has everything to do with the Wolfman form. Half man, half wolf has never entirely done it for me, if I'm honest. You should always go full werewolf if you want to bring the hardcore scares. In the past, whenever I saw the Wolfman form compared to the grossly feral and unsightly terror of the werewolf in all of its glory, the Wolfman sometimes displays too much humanism and doesn't evoke the same primal fear we experienced in American Werewolf in London, for example. It all depends on the execution and if they've planned to surprise us with some outside of the box thinking, as I don't think I'm going to be significantly impressed if the most we see are those familiar tropes of a man in a wolf costume performing acrobatics and jump scares to enthrall the audience. I'd even make the claim that this adaptation may focus more on the threat of the disease and its corruption, as a central focal point in building tension and suspense instead of the generic use of violence and carnage to create fear. There have been many fantastic transformation scenes in the past that have shocked audiences with their practical special effects, but they were brief and intense. So I wonder if, given all the emphasis that the teaser places on the horror of the infection process and the evidence that it might be a long and excruciating process, this could be a great way forward in lifting the curse of the dreaded beaten path in storytelling within this particular subgenre. Again, I have to reference 2021's The Cursed because, for whatever faults half of you apparently found in this gem, at least it tried to be original in its story and execution. My biggest question is whether they are setting up a dark universe that will eventually bring all of these universal monsters together for a second recent attempt after Tom Cruise's wishful venture, which was stopped dead in its tracks after box office numbers were very shy of the intended mark. A significant part of me hopes this won't be the case, as there is less room for failure if they bring in a different director for each project and focus on them as separate stories. However, it's impossible to know their intentions at this stage, especially with that big Easter egg reveal that we had at the end of the last voyage of the Demeter, if any of you have seen it yet. I won't spoil it, but the film is adapted from one chapter of Bram Stoker's Dracula novel, and the way it concluded was left somewhat unresolved, shall we say. Please check it out if somehow this one passed you by. As soon as I know more, I will be making another video on this film, as the werewolf subgenre will always have a place in my heart. Even if the sad truth of the matter is we honestly do not have that many great lycanthropy movies to talk about, save some of the obvious classics that I mentioned earlier. So let's pray for a werewolf renaissance, I suppose, and an end to the terrifyingly majestic beast confined to B movies only, please. After watching the trailer, let me know if you also felt that spark of curiosity and intrigue. Either way, fingers crossed, right? I'll be discussing HBO's new Salem's Lot adaptation in my next video. And yes, I know after banging on about needing more werewolf films in the mix, I'll be covering yet another vampire release. But it looks to be worth the effort, so stay entertained and we'll speak soon.